Hello everyone, Professor Quizlook here. I wanted to make a video talking a little bit further about hybrid regimes and competitive authoritarianism in particular. So in some previous videos I talked about non-democracies, authoritarian regimes, how there are different types of authoritarian regimes, how political scientists categorize various governments. And so one that made an appearance in several of my videos is this idea of competitive authoritarianism. And so we know this is a term that refers to countries that are a bit of a hybrid. A hybrid political regime where there are elements of democracy, but also elements of authoritarianism, elements of democratic governance, as well as authoritarian tendencies. So there might be in most, and again, every nation state's different. Every country is different. As political scientists, we try to break down and think about the best ways to categorize governments, the best way to categorize nation states. And there's always some overlap, and there's always some instances where this country fits in this box, but not this box. So again, we have to paint with a bit of a broad brush when we were just talking about governing regimes themselves. So when we're thinking about competitive authoritarianism, there are these formal democratic institutions. Elections. A huge one that we see is elections. We know in a democracy, elections play a huge role. They're feedback mechanisms for those in power. It is a way to elect new people, kick out old people that citizens don't want in government anymore. The hallmark of a democracy are elections. Well, in competitive authoritarian states, there are also elections. There are also opposition parties. There are also courts. There's legislatures. So we see these pieces of a democracy that we know are important in a democratic system, but we see them in an authoritarian state. So there are these formal democratic institutions. They just are systematically undermined. They don't have that same power that they do in a democracy. So when we think about how leaders stay in power, again, as we talked about in previous videos, it's not about Hitler's Germany or Stalin's USSR, those totalitarian regimes. Today, authoritarians, especially in like competitive authoritarian states, leaders stay in power. They don't necessarily abolish democracy. They don't have jackbooted thugs in the street all the time. So they don't necessarily just simply abolish democracy outright, but instead they manipulate these institutions. So if the institutions of a democracy exist, elections, the court, opposition parties, those exist in competitive authoritarian states. But in the competitive authoritarian states, the regime manipulates these institutions. So such regimes maintain this appearance of democracy. And it does, and when we think about why, it does give some international legitimacy and some domestic support. So when we think about international legitimacy, one thing we know that competitive authoritarian states want is foreign direct investment. They want democracies, they want other countries to invest capital into their country to help grow the economy. Well, you need some form of international legitimacy. We know that companies don't want to invest in nation states that simply repress and brutalize their own citizens. So having this appearance and having some democracy makes it easier on the international stage for countries to receive foreign direct investment. At least that's an argument that many political scientists that study authoritarian regimes have articulated, that this is one of the key reasons that nation states that are considered semi-authoritarian, competitive authoritarian, utilize these state institutions. They want this international legitimacy. So when we think about why else, so domestic support, so you still have some semblance of democracy, you still have some semblance of elections. That does grow domestic support. So if you look at competitive authoritarian states, Russia's a great example of this. We see that elections do exist, but they are, of course, not free and they are not fair. And so if we break down and think about, okay, what does this actually mean? Incumbents enjoy massive advantages, at times using state funds, using the state coffer to have an advantage in elections, have an advantage in not buying votes, but having social programs targeted at individuals at very specific locations that will then means they will vote for the particular candidate. And of course, state-run media. So if the incumbent enjoys this advantage with state-run media, you can imagine the positive images, the positive narrative that state-run media can generate. So we see that there are electoral commissions and courts, often packed with loyalists who roll in favor of the regime, who are just in the court or in the side of the regime. So you have massive advantages in money of using state funds, the media, you have courts and electoral commissions that are packed for those in charge. We might see that vote rigging occurs. Sometimes there is this general vote rigging. Again, as I brought up in a previous video, Russia is a really good example of this, where we literally can, if you go on YouTube and search for it, you can literally find evidence of ballot rigging, of election officials putting ballots in ballot boxes that are not real. But that isn't always occurring. We know in some of the most authoritarian states, you might see like a 98% election results. In most competitive authoritarian states, it's not that outlandish. 60, 70, 80%, but not 98 like Muammar Gaddafi had. Other things that we see that are key characteristics, gerrymandering. Gerrymandering, which you might be familiar with from the US example. We know that semi-authoritarian regimes utilize gerrymandering as well. Also, changing of electoral laws. And not like 2 years before the election, but sometimes right before the election or during the election. Russia, again, we saw this in Russia with Alexei Navalny. New rules were passed when Navalny was trying to run for mayor of Moscow that were designed to try to force him not to be able to vote. So we see this changing of electoral laws. Okay, so let's just think again for a minute about media and civil society. So independent media faces intimidation, fines, closure. Again, Russia is a great example of this. Independent media has been harassed, has been intimidated. Some independent media has been forced to close, has received fines for a wide variety of things. So the regime uses these intimidation tactics to stop people from sharing what's going on across the country. Ruling parties create this, what's considered a media monopoly through ownership, licensing, or advertising restrictions, again, making it harder and harder for alternative media sources to exist, to give a narrative that is not friendly towards the regime. And of course, we see civil society groups, especially those that are maybe have a foreign tie or receive some money from abroad. We see new laws. Russia is a great example of this. The Republic of Georgia has experienced this, where foreign agent laws are passed that can really restrict independent media from existing in a country. So we see that Russia really fits all of these bills. So if you read about competitive authoritarianism, if you read academic journals or books on it, Russia's oftentimes given as an example of a competitive authoritarian state. Some, like Timothy Fry, who characterized Russia as a personalistic regime, a lot of overlap. Remember, like I said at the outset, there's a lot of overlap between these different types of regime types. So Russia, oftentimes given as the example, elections do occur regularly, but the real opposition is maybe disqualified, jailed, excluded. New laws and legal cases emerge to make it so the opposition can't run, so the opposition's disqualified, so the opposition's jailed. Navalny, as we know, was jailed and then died in incarceration. Again, in Russia, media control, state control of the media ensures that there's a pro-Kremlin narrative. And if you're more familiar with the US, or you live in the US, and maybe you're thinking, oh, well, why don't they just read a different news source or watch a different news source? In a place like Moscow or St. Petersburg, that's doable. But across much of Russia, we know that citizens still get their news from state-controlled media, especially in the provinces and mono towns across the country. Many citizens, especially older citizens, which make up the population of many of these towns, they still are exposed to state-controlled media. They don't have alternative media sources. So then they're exposed to state-run media. They're exposed to that propaganda or those narratives that the regime wants. And what we see in Russia is also that there are pretty loyal oligarchs who fund campaigns, who are critical of NGOs, really friends of Putin, who are in his inner circle. So when we think of competitive authoritarianism, we oftentimes, Russia's a great example. Another reason is the government uses strategic repression. So just enough to suppress dissent, but not so much to provoke backlash. So we saw this in Ukraine with the Maidan Revolution, where the Maidan really only grew and grew massively after the Ukrainian authorities used violence against protesters. That triggered more people to take to the streets. And as more people took to the streets, the regime met them with violence. And then more people took to the streets and demanded that they be treated with dignity. So in competitive authoritarian regimes, remember, it's not like the Stalinist USSR. There's not just mass repression. Instead, it's strategic repression. Just enough to suppress dissent, but not provoke backlash. And so we see this, maybe protest leaders are arrested, or random people at a protest are arrested. That way, other protesters might be afraid, I might be next. If it's kind of random, you're concerned of who might be next, and it might be you. And of course, in Russia, we see that there are constitutional changes. For example, in 2020, allowed Putin to reset term limits and potentially roll until 2036. So these just changes to the constitution to benefit those in charge. There are other examples of competitive authoritarian states that are sometimes more debated. Turkey is a good example. Ben Rhodes, the former I forget exactly the role he had in the Obama administration, Ben Rhodes, but he still does a podcast, and he's written a couple books where he considers Turkey to be a competitive authoritarian state. Other political scientists still categorize Turkey more democratic, but we see other states, that's the takeaway, we see other states who some political scientists, some analysts considered to be competitive authoritarian. Hungary is another example. Some authors say Hungary, Turkey are on this path following Russia. A little bit more debate and back and forth there. Russia is usually a safe bet to be considered competitive authoritarian, or at least authoritarian with an adjective. Okay, so thanks for watching. I like talking about authoritarian states because I think they're interesting. I think they're interesting to think about how different governments around the world are structured. And so I just wanted to make a video talking about one that you might hear if you're on Blue Sky or Twitter, you're watching the news. Every once in a while, this term competitive authoritarianism arises, and I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about it. Okay, thank you.